Welcome
And
everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with you guys tonight and to introduce Richard Halpern, who taught at Yale, CU Boulder, UC Berkeley, Johns Hopkins, NYU. That's probably enough to name.
Okay.
And is an expert in Renaissance literature, especially Shakespeare, drama, and I would just say like aesthetics and politics and metaphysics and ontology
Wow.
and things like that. He's I don't think ever been housed in a philosophy department, but
No.
when you write a book on Leibniz, you get
Okay.
honorary
Okay. Okay.
acceptance
That's
into
good
the
enough.
philosopher's
That's good enough.
cave or whatever. So,
Okay.
Richard, it's great to have you here. I will say quickly, I love when I come across a book in a bookstore that I've never heard of, and I pulled this off the shelf. I forget the name of this bookstore in San Francisco. That's
Huh.
really big, like multiple levels and stuff. It's right near a
Mhm.
bunch of like bars and stuff. Anybody know what bookstore I'm talking about? Anyway, it's a really great
Mr.
bookstore.
Views,
I think so. Yeah,
like near
exactly.
Mr.
Yeah, yeah.
Like
So I found it there.
City
And
Lights.
obviously the title immediately I was like, this is incredible. What is this? I'm a process philosopher. Like I come from that
Oh,
background. So I see this and I'm like,
okay.
amazing. I open up and one of the first pages is about the first pages that I look at is about the harmonic series, which is an area
Oh
of
no.
study that I'm obsessed with. And I was
Oh,
like, okay, I have to get this book. I
okay.
read it, was in love with it, and have been trying to get Richard here for some time because of that. Um, anyway, that's enough of an introduction, I
Okay,
think.
that's
I'll
plenty.
pass it off
Thank
to
you.
you now.
That's going to be hard to live up to. So yeah, I just want to start by thanking you for inviting me to do it, and thank Afshin and Kate for helping to set it up. I appreciate that. So when Jack asked me to give this talk, he said, "Well, you can talk about the book, but try to focus on interdisciplinarity and the infinite." And I thought, okay, I can do each of those separately, but together, that's an interesting challenge. And so, but I came up with a way to do it, and
Mhm.
that's to talk about motion, which obviously is a central concept of the book, as you can tell from the title. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to maybe the first half I'll be discussing a couple of themes from the book, and then I'm going to move on to something that's not in the book, which is the problem of physical motion in Leibniz, the problem of physical bodies moving through space, which is a really vexing problem for Leibniz, as it was for most philosophers of the 17th century, and things get kind of weird, which is to say good. Two
Mhm.
quick prefaces. First, who the hell was Leibniz? And I don't know, some of you may know him well, some of you may know him a little bit. I'll just a few facts. He was a philosopher, mathematician, scientist, historian, legal scholar, etc. I'll get into that a little later, and that'll bring us to interdisciplinarity. Probably his most, I mean, although he's one of the best known philosophers in the history of philosophy, he's actually probably even more important as a mathematician because he was one of the two inventors of the calculus. He and Sir Isaac Newton invented it at about the same time and then immediately engaged in a vicious battle over who had really invented it, and accusations of plagiarism and so forth flew back and forth. Along with the French philosopher René Descartes and the Dutch philosopher Baruch Spinoza, who's also one of the great so-called rationalist philosophers of the 17th century, which is a descriptor rationalist, which is at best only somewhat helpful. But I'll be talking about that a little bit. Okay, so that's who was Leibniz, and here he is. Here's his mug in all of its glorious bewigged presence. Um, Second quick preference, yeah. So how did an English professor end up writing on Leibniz? I have no formal training in philosophy at all, though I find it interesting to read. I was teaching a graduate course on the Baroque, and one of the main theoretical texts for the course is a book entitled The Fold, Leibniz and the Baroque by the French philosopher Gilles Deleuze. Um, and later in this talk, I'm actually going to be looking at the Fold and the Baroque, so I thought I'd mention it. And it's kind of an amazing book, but I thought, well, if I'm teaching Deleuze on Leibniz, I probably should read some Leibniz as well. And I did, and I found him immediately mesmerizing and incredibly trippy, which is what I really most love about him. And that interest eventuated in a book on the topic, and the title of that book is Leibnizing a Philosopher in Motion. Let me give you a couple of the premises of what a major premise of the book is that Leibniz was a great writer, or at least an interesting writer, as well as a philosopher, and that his talents and practices as a writer are not just like the icing on the cake of his philosophy, but really have an important relation to the substance of his philosophy. And this is something that Leibniz scholars tend not to pay much attention to. But I thought, well, as a literary critic, I'm at least well positioned to do that. Um, he's, what I would call a writerly philosopher. Like of great philosophers, some are also great writers. Plato, Nietzsche, Kierkegaard, you can name others. Some are great philosophers, but not particularly great writers, maybe Aristotle, Kant, although Kant has his moments. But Leibniz is really a writerly philosopher. And what I want to do with this notion of Leibniz as a writer is to displace or at least modify a traditional view of him as a system builder. And really all the rationalist philosophers are associated with philosophical systems, probably most justly, to my mind, most justly Spinoza. At least the Ethics has that kind of geometrical method where he tries to argue logically interlocking propositions that have the irrefutable qualities of a geometrical proof. Um, Leibniz is less, and of course, the ethics isn't really entirely that way, and Leibniz is even far less that way. But he was someone who didn't set for himself small, well-defined philosophical problems. He was interested in explaining the metaphysical structure of the entire universe. And he saw that universe as an ordered system, so it would make sense that his philosophy was a systematic philosophy. So in those two senses, that the things he's describing is systematic, and the philosophy at least gestures towards a high level of logical and conceptual coherence with parts that fit together. The problems with philosophical systems is that they're static. They're structures. It's like a beautiful castle built out of interlocking Lego pieces. It's great, but it just kind of sits there. Against that, I wanted to look at Leibniz as a writer, someone who produces sentences, and sentences are things that unfold over time, right? I mean, whether you're reading them or saying them, and so do paragraphs, and so do works. And so if you start looking at Leibniz as a writer, then the stasis of the system starts being set into motion. Okay, so this is the first form of motion, kind of metaphorical one that I'm invoking, which is the movement of writing through time as sentences unfold through time. I look at a lot of that closely in the book. I'm not going to do that here. I also want to mention in the context of writing, one of the rhetorical figures that is very interesting to Leibniz is metaphor, and metaphor is also a bearer of motion. The word metaphor means to carry or move something from one place to another. And so if you go to modern day Athens and you see a moving truck, they're often called metaphores because they're like metaphors. And if you say something like love is a rose, you're taking something from one conceptual space, a plant, and you're asserting its equivalence to a human emotion. Love. So there's a kind of, so this isn't a temporal movement. It's a kind of, as I say, it's a kind of movement through conceptual space. And that's something about metaphor that really interests Leibniz as well. So that's a second form of motion. Now, in the book, I try to come up with a sort of a different identity for Leibniz that isn't that of the system builder, but incorporates these various qualities that I've been talking about. And what I come up with is the notion of the tinkerer. I should want to talk about that for a little bit. So a tinkerer is someone who repairs things or builds things, but in a kind of trial and error fashion. It's not a like a trained professional. It's kind of a hobbyist or amateur or someone who kind of enjoys puttering around in a workshop and makes use of the things in that workshop. And the thing about tinkering is that the process of making is so pleasurable that it can begin to displace even the practical goals, which were the reason for undertaking the activity in the first place. And I think that is true of Leibniz. And in fact, um, Leibniz, he thought that the philosopher had an obligation to society and so should undertake practical projects. And he undertook a number which were either for the public good or sometimes for his own good. And I want to talk about a couple of them because it'll give you a sense of Leibniz as a tinkerer. And one is a history he wrote of the Guelph family. And the Guelph family was a noble family in Bavaria, which exercised their rule not only there, but over much of Europe. And in fact, if the name Guelph rings a bell with you at all, you'll be thinking of the Battle of the Guelphs and the Ghibellines in Florence in Dante's day. That's how far their rule extended. And Leibniz's patron, the Duke of Hanover, was descended from the Guelph family. So he said, "Hey, Leibniz, I'm paying you. I want you to write me a history of the Guelph family." So he starts at it and he uncovers a lot of sources and makes some significant historical discoveries. And he's writing this. But then he decides, well, you can't really understand the Guelphs unless you understand the geological qualities of the areas over which they ruled. So I'd better look into that as well. So now what starts as a historical project is kind of a historical geological project at the same time. And then he thinks to himself, well, you can't really understand the geology of those areas unless you understand the entire geological history of the Earth. And so he then went about and wrote a geological history of the Earth known as the Protogaea. Um, and this project stretched on for decades. It was still unfinished at Leibniz's death. It infuriated his patron, the Duke of Hanover, because the thing never came out, but he was just at it. So this is our first. So when I talk about getting from point A to point B, this is my first example. Like, what is it like to get from point A to point B with Leibniz? Point A is you haven't written the history of the Guelphs, and point B is you've written the history of the Guelphs. Well, the problem is it's not a straight line. It starts wandering about, and the line from point A to point B ends up becoming longer and longer, so that even though you're making progress, you're never really getting towards the end. Um, I don't know why this made, when I was writing, it made me think, I'll say, maybe think about driving to Los Angeles. So if you have business in Los Angeles, you're going to take the 5, right? It's the straight shot. It takes you through Central California. There's not much to see along the way, but it'll get you to Los Angeles. You're going to do your business. If you're going on vacation to Los Angeles, you're going to take the 1, which is along the coastline, and it's beautiful, but it's winding. It's going to take you forever to get there. My point is Leibniz always took the 1, okay? Always took Route 1 with whatever he was doing. One example is this history of the Guelph family. Another example is this calculating machine. And I'm going to skip over a couple of things and show you. There we go. There's Leibniz's calculating machine. The dials at the top allowed you to choose numbers, and if you turn the handles, it's supposed to add and subtract and multiply and divide. Okay. The problem is it was never fully functional. It could add and subtract, but it never really could multiply and divide. And again, he kept working on it forever, and it never really fulfilled its promise. Um, he did take it around though and show it to people to impress them. And one of the places he took it was the Royal Society of London, which was a scientific society established under King Charles II after the English Restoration. And he showed it to the scientists there, among whom was the great English scientist Robert Hooke. And Robert Hooke looked at the thing, he opened the back of it, he inspected the mechanism, he closed the door. And after that meeting, he went and designed his own calculating machine in a matter of weeks, which was more functional than Leibniz's. It worked better than Leibniz's that Leibniz had been working on for decades because Hooke was a better engineer than Leibniz was. And here's what he had to say about Leibniz's calculating machine, and you'll pardon me, the spelling is in the original 17th century text. It seemed to me so complicated with wheels, pinions, cant-rights, springs, screws, stops, and truckles that I could not perceive it ever to be of any great use, especially common use. It could only be fit for great persons to purchase, and for great force to remove and manage, and for great wits to understand and comprehend. Okay, so what he's saying is it's basically, this isn't a practical machine, it's kind of a showpiece. And the reason it is that is because Leibniz loves mechanisms so much. He's like putting so many gizmos and parts into it that it's not really efficient. So this is another version of it. It's not, it's like he has this machine, it supposedly has a practical end, but his love of complexity and complex mechanism causes him to produce something which is really more an aesthetic object, something to look at and marvel at rather than something that you would calculate with. Um, and as I argue in my book, you can kind of take Hooke's description of the calculating machine and apply it to Leibniz's metaphysical system. It also has a great love of complexity and has a great many moving parts and has a great abundance of mechanism in it, but and therefore that for that reason may not be entirely practical. Um, Okay, so so these are a couple of examples of Leibniz the tinkerer. So if Leibniz is a tinkerer and a philosophical tinkerer, that's our next step. What are the materials in his workshop? What does he have lying around that he can improvise with? Well, in part, he has the history of philosophy, which is what all philosophers have available to them. And in fact, Leibniz makes abundant use of his contemporaries, Descartes and Spinoza and Locke and others, but also Plato and Aristotle and medieval scholastics and Hermetic and Kabbalistic philosophers. He's kind of like a magpie picking pieces from their various systems. But that doesn't really account for the quality of his thinking. His workshop is actually the totality of human knowledge at the time. And what I mean by that is Leibniz was known as the last universal genius. This was a term that was applied to him, which means that he didn't know everything that human beings knew, but he knew everything pretty much that had ever appeared in a scholarly journal or in a book. Okay, if it had been published, it was pretty likely that Leibniz knew it. He not only read widely in, but made substantial contributions to the following fields. Obviously philosophy and mathematics, but also physics, biology, chemistry, logic, geology, history, ethnography, linguistics, political science, theology, aesthetics, and on and on. He left behind some 200,000 manuscript pages on these various project. He also, by the way, might be of interest, wrote some very interesting pieces on Chinese philosophy, if anybody wants to look those up as well. So in one sense, philosophy was just one of many disciplinary, we'll call them disciplinary fields that Leibniz worked in. But what made it different from the others is it was the one where all the others could be brought to bear. Okay, and I'll show you how that works a little bit in a minute. Um, well, I'll do that right now. No, I'm going to switch. Okay, so here's, I'm not going to look at, I asked the question, what is the, Leibniz's most famous concept or term is the monad. He didn't invent it like everything else, he borrowed it, but he gave it a distinctive turn. A monad is a mind, I guess you could put it that way, the most simply. But Leibniz has a number of definitions of it, and they're rather diverse definitions. And I'm trying to get rid of this thing here. Okay, sorry. And they come from different places. Wait, sorry. They come from different places. So at one point he defines I'm not quoting him here, but these are his definitions. He defines a monad as a sequence of perceptions driven by appetition. That is to say, monads perceive one thing after another, and a kind of desire leads you from one to the next. Well, that concept is borrowed from the fields of biology and psychology. At the same time, he describes a monad as a perspective or point of view on the universe, which is something that comes from both optics and painting. He describes it as a constellation of active and passive forces, which comes from physics. He describes it as a complete concept composed of an infinity of predicates, which comes from logic. He describes it as an infinite series governed by a rule, which comes from mathematics, and an entelechy, which comes from Aristotelian metaphysics. These are all very interesting definitions of a monad, and they all tell you something interesting about the monad, but it's very hard to synthesize them. Like they don't translate easily into one another. And for a supposedly systemic philosopher, he actually just kind of shuttles back and forth between them. But you can see, the interdisciplinary nature is that all these other disciplinary areas are being carried over into philosophy in something very like metaphor. That is to say, when you say a monad is a constellation of active and passive forces, you're doing something very much like you are when you say love is a rose, right? You're taking two things that are unlike and you're declaring an identity between the two. And so um, this is one of the reasons why Leibniz's philosophy is so rich, and it's also a reason why it's not terribly linear at the same time. Okay, so I want to move on now to I want to continue looking at motion in Leibniz by turning first to the notion of mathematical motion and then looking at physical motion. So I want to start with a quote from Leibniz's Discourse on Metaphysics, which is an early work, and it's a favorite quote of mine. He says, suppose, for example, that someone puts a number of completely haphazard points on paper, as people do who practice the ridiculous art of geomancy. That is, say there was people could kind of prophecy by interpreting random dots. I say that it's possible to find a geometrical line whose notion is constant and uniform according to a certain rule, such that the line passes through all the points and in the same order as they were drawn. Now, what does he mean by that? So here's some random point, or the best I could do with random points on a piece of paper. Someone put them down. He said there will always be a line. I'm sorry, this is so like I'm not a good drawing, but I just tried to do it. So you could have a line, kind of a curvy line that would pass through all of them in order. Now, his point is not just that you can draw a line. Okay, that would be kind of fatuous. Like, of course, you can draw a line. He's saying you can draw a line which would be the expression of a mathematical equation. Okay, this is there's some equation that if plotted out, if graphed, will give you this result. And the point is that what looked like it was haphazard or chaotic or random follows a rule. It's a rule-governed movement, okay? Um, and he brings it up in the context of discussing human lives, or really we call it the lives of the monad. Our lives are composed of events, and sometimes those events seem kind of random or unexpected or haphazard. But he argues there's a rule inside every monad, including you, in which these are all sort of plotted out in advance, and it will move from one to the other. So he's making a point that what scary things like the chaotic are actually rule governed and can be understood by the human mind and can be illuminated by it. Okay. However, there are a couple of things about this kind of line. And notice this is we have another kind of wavy line here, of the kind we've been looking at before this. In order for this to happen, the line has to be what modern mathematicians would call smooth and continuous, okay? It doesn't have breaks or gaps in it, and it doesn't have sudden angles in it, okay? And the reason that's important is because Leibniz's calculus, which would allow him to understand curves, of various kinds with a depth that had not been proper before, works only on smooth and continuous functions. So I'm not going to get too much, but here's like a, well, no, obvious y equals x squared. This is a nice, well-behaved mathematical function. It goes on, there are no gaps in it, nothing happens to it, just kind of it kind of goes down and goes up, nothing too abrupt. By contrast, the equation y equals the absolute value is well behaved, it's continuous, but it's kind of misbehaved at 0, 0. There's a sudden angle there. And in fact, you can't calculate. It's not differentiable at that. You can't, the calculus can't calculate its derivatives at the point 0, 0. So at that one place, it's kind of opaque. Here's another mathematical equation, y equals 1 over x. Here, the problem is not that it's not smooth, it's that it's not continuous, because as you approach the 0 point from the right, positive numbers, it goes to positive infinity. And if you oppose it from the left, it goes to negative infinity. So it doesn't really have a value at 0 and is discontinuous. And so again, calculus can make sense of this function, except at that kind of singularity point where it's discontinuous. You may wonder why I'm going into this. This will come back in a little bit. Okay. Let me see. Okay. All right, so let's now go on to the problem of physical motion in Leibniz, the movement of bodies through space. Leibniz's calculus allowed understanding, a much deeper understanding of motion than had existed before. If you had a function that described the position of a particle in space, you could now calculate its speed and its acceleration and so forth in ways you couldn't before. But philosophically, motion was really problematic. And here's the thing. So let's say a billiard ball moves from point A to point B, right? Let's say point B is a foot away. Well, how do you understand what's happening when that motion happens? Obviously, it has to pass through intermediate points. So the tendency is to break it up into smaller and smaller units. And the smaller you get, maybe you get closer to understanding what motion is. And so it's natural enough to draw on the geometrical notion that lines are composed of points and assume that motion goes from point to point along a line. And that's how something moves through space. But the notion that a line is composed of geometric dimensionless points created all sorts of problems. And for a number of philosophers, including Leibniz, for one thing, it means that a line that's twice the length of another line has exactly the same number of points as that other line, because infinity is infinity. There are infinity number, it's the problem of the mathematics of infinity, and Leibniz was uncomfortable. Or what does it even mean to say it moves from point to point? You tend to think of points as like little BBs, right? Except really, really small, like points as very, very small things, but that nevertheless have a diameter. And so like, just as you could put two marbles or two BBs together, you can put two points. But the problem is points are dimensionless. They have no size whatsoever. And so it makes no sense, in a sense, to talk about the point next to it. On a geometrical line, no matter what second point you choose, there's still an infinity of points in between it and the original point, okay? And so this problem became known as the labyrinth of the continuum, because philosophers who tried to think through how the continuum was composed of points would just get lost in these paradoxes, and they just didn't have an understanding of the mathematics of infinity in a way that would come about later in the history of mathematics. And in fact, Leibniz believed, because of that, he believed that lines were not composed of points. The only points on a line were the end points, and it was just continuous in between it. But if that's the case, then the problem of motion is back where we started again. Like, you were trying to understand it by breaking it down into smaller points, but now you have to give up on that, and you're back with the original problem. So that was his issue. Um, now, um, but but the physics of motion gets even more complicated for Leibniz than that, and here's where things get really interesting. So let's imagine not a kind of theoretical point moving through space, but an actual physical body moving through space. Well, what do we mean by space? There's no such thing as empty space for Leibniz. He didn't believe there was such a thing as a vacuum. Bodies moved through a kind of liquid for him. Everything that looked like empty space was filled with a liquid, and they were little tiny balls of whatever, of liquid, of which were themselves solid. Well, as is the case with water, water molecules are not liquid. Water is liquid. So you have them right next to each other, and so there should be no empty space, but there's still that space between them. So he believed there were smaller particles that occupied that space and then you have smaller empty spaces still, and so there were other particles in there, and it went on until infinity. And so if you kept doing that, it would kind of fill space. And one consequence of that is space was what he called a plenum. It was full of things. And so if something moves in space, it's pushing against all these little particles. And since they're pushing against other particles and other particles, it communicates any movement through the entire universe, which means that your body is taking in the impression of everything that's going on in the universe, no matter how far away or how small the thing moving or doing something might tend to be. Um, Many of those impressions will be unconscious, but they'll still be registered by you. Okay. So, because of this, motion now becomes more complicated because something starts moving in one direction, but then it's hit by a particle and it's kind of jostled and moves and starts moving in another direction. But as soon as that happens, another particle, probably still smaller, hits it and moves it in still another direction. And since they go on, those in size go down to infinity, the divergences go down to infinity as well. Um, this is a lot like modern concept known as Brownian motion. If you drop a grain of pollen in a still glass of water, it'll start moving around in this random pattern because the water molecules are hitting it and moving it around, and it'll cause this kind of tangly motion. And that's kind of what um, motion becomes for Leibniz as well. Now, this, he liked this because it meant it solved a problem for him. No matter where you are on motion, you're at an end point because motion is always changing direction, right? So therefore, the points are real because they're not points along a linear continuum. They're the end point of a new motion, except it'll immediately change again and again and again and again. Um, okay. Now, there's a modern Leibniz scholar named Samuel Levy who works on the problems of infinity and motion in Leibniz, and he makes the very helpful suggestion that we can understand Leibniz's understanding of motion by looking at something called a Koch curve. That's Koch. And that's a form of fractal. It's a fractal shape, which means it's of partial dimensions. I won't go into what that means. But basically, it's very simple. You start on the left with an isosceles triangle, all equal sizes, right? And then you divide each side into three. And then in the middle third, you put another isosceles triangle, which is identical to the larger triangle. And now it looks like a Star of David. But then you do that, you repeat that on each one. You put a smaller triangle, and then you keep going. So this takes it through three stages, but go through infinity. And therefore you have sometimes called a Koch snowflake, because it starts looking like a snowflake the longer you do it. Now, this is described by fractal geometry, which wasn't invented until the 20th century. But Leibniz was the mathematician who worked out fractal geometry, Benoit Mandelbrot, read some of Leibniz's papers and thought that Leibniz, as with many other things, was sort of startlingly prescient about how figures like this worked. He was certainly interested in the notion of recursive self-similarity, which is something that these figures exhibit. Um, so, so Levy sees the Koch curve. So no matter where you are moving, you're going to be displaced. Once you keep this going through infinity, the displacements are going to get smaller and smaller. He uses this as an illustration of Leibniz's solution to the problem of physical motion. And I think that's a good way of thinking about it. There's one quality of the Koch curve that Levy doesn't mention or apparently think about, which is the fact that Koch curves are infinite in length. Okay, they don't just have an infinity point, they're infinitely long. If you saw a Koch snowflake that was like an inch, that looked like an inch big, if you started pulling on it and unraveling, it would be infinite length. And not only is the whole thing infinite length, but any 2 points, A and B, on it, no matter how close together they seem to be to you, are also an infinite distance apart. Okay, so Leibniz's solution to the problem of motion actually renders motion impossible. Even traveling the smallest conceivable distance requires traversing a line of infinite length, which seems like that seems like very Leibnizian to me. Um, okay. Now, Leibniz sets forth his theory on theories of motion in an early dialogue called Pisidius to Philalethes. It's not the most elegant title in the world. And in that, he uses the figure of the fold to describe the way motion works and the way the continuum is put together. And this passage is crucial for Deleuze. It's kind of a locus classicus of the role of the fold in Leibniz. So he says the division of the continuum must not be considered to be like the division of sand into grains. In other words, it's not like a line that's broken down into points, right? Separate little minima, but like that of a sheet of paper or tunic into folds. And so although there occur some folds smaller than others, infinite in number, a body is never thereby dissolved into points or minima. It is just as if we suppose a tunic to be scored with folds multiplied to infinity in such a way that there is no fold so small that it is not subdivided by a new fold. And yet in this way, no point in the tunic will be assignable without its being moved different directions by its neighbors, although it will not be torn apart by them. And the tunic cannot be said to be resolved all the way down into points. Instead, although some folds are smaller than others to infinity, bodies are always extended and points never become parts, but always remain mere extrema. Okay. So there he's using the fold to describe this image. It's kind of a beautiful image of a folded tunic, except each fold of the tunic has folds inside of that, and those folds have folds inside of that, and it goes on and on into infinity. Here. Sorry, I'm losing my place here. Okay, so, but something interesting is going on here. So this is Deleuze's figure of the fold, but you may already have noticed that it kind of domesticates motion as Leibniz understands it, because a fold is smooth and continuous, right? It changes, but it's always like curving. There are no abrupt changes in direction in it. And so a fold would be differentiable by calculus. It's a well-behaved motion, which you can use calculus to understand. Leibniz's understanding of motion, which is more like a Brownian motion with these sudden abrupt changes in direction, like the Koch curve is not differentiable at any point. There's no, like Leibniz's calculus just can't make sense of it. And so in a sense, it's a more radical notion. Okay, it's like the fold. It's not discontinuous, but it's not smooth. It's abrupt and jumpy and tangled. I want to say that the fold is for Leibniz a somewhat domesticated version of the tangle, which is, I think, a potentially more interesting notion. Now, having said that, Deleuze uses the fold to make connections between um, Leibniz and Baroque art. Um, this is a kind of almost cliched example. Gian Lorenzo Bernini's statue of the Ecstasy of Saint Teresa, where she's basically nothing but folds. Um, but even things like the curvilinear facades on Baroque architecture also kind of incorporate a kind of folding motion into it. And that sort of got me wondering, okay, so if the fold has a kind of aesthetic counterpart, is there an aesthetic counterpart to the tangle in the Baroque that might be interesting as well? And what I decided was, and this is maybe not in the Italian Baroque so much. I think they would find tangles ugly, but in the Northern Baroque, in Dutch art and architecture, you get something more like that. So here's a landscape by Jacob van der Riesdael of some trees and water. And Riesdael was an amazing painter of trees. And the tree is kind of in between the fold and the tangle. That is to say, there are large limbs which are kind of smoothly curving one way, but then there are sort of little branches coming off it, and the thing as a whole offers a kind of visual tangle that the eye can't quite penetrate in the same way that the jagged line of the Koch snowflake isn't penetrable by calculus. And for Riesdael, even it's not even trees, but he has like brambles and bushes and such, which are just completely visually opaque. You can't follow the movement of them. This is part of the Dutch landscape. Or here's another example. Here's a sketch by Riesdael of a ruined farmhouse. And not only would the depiction of ruins have been kind of not that popular in the Italian Baroque, right? It's kind of order falling into disorder, but also the acute angles and the sort of tangled mass of things, it seems to me would be considered unbeautiful from the point of view of the Italian Baroque, but is from the perspective um, of the Dutch Baroque. Okay. Um, so, um, yeah, this, in a way, this farmhouse is the opposite of what Leibniz was describing in that sentence we looked at from the Discourse on Metaphysics, right? He was saying something that looked random, haphazard, is actually rule driven and structured. Here's a structure falling into randomness or chaos or the state of the haphazard, um, which corresponds more to his theory of motion. So there's a kind of tension between them. Okay. So let me sum up. My book makes the point that Leibniz's thought is always in motion. But once we see what motion is for Leibniz, or at least what physical motion is for Leibniz, we see that motion is impossible. It never really gets anywhere because the path from point A to point B is always infinitely long and infinitely crooked. All motion, in a sense, is Brownian motion. Um, as we saw with the Guelph history and with the calculating machine, the path to completion is always being elongated and the end is never reached, in part because of a process of endless digression. I think part of what makes this possible is interdisciplinarity. Remember, I asked you to think about interdisciplinary as a billiard ball that's being nudged by other billiard balls. Well, that's kind of Leibniz's understanding. I mean, in a way, his understanding of physical motion is an allegory of his philosophical method, and his philosophical method is kind of an allegory of his understanding um, uh, of physical motion. Everything's being bombarded by something or hit by something. And so it's always being thrown off track. And so that track becomes longer and longer, um, uh, infinitely long, an infinitely interrupted line that never gets anywhere. Okay. So Um, this is just maybe another way of saying that the goals of philosophy are constantly being hijacked by the pleasures of philosophy, and the pleasures of bringing different kinds of disciplinary knowledge to bear on problems. Philosophy, or at least Leibniz's version of it, is perfectly content never to get anywhere, even though it's constantly in motion. All right. I will stop there. And I'll be happy to take questions if you have them, or comments, or
Thank you,
whatever.
Richard. That was incredible. I love this, especially this last one of the last sentences you said about there's a sort of fractal isomorphism between the
Mhm.
role of movement, his approach to it, and then the meta structure of his philosophical thought itself. And the role of metaphor is just so fascinating, I think, in Leibniz. And yeah, I really want to dive more into this and have a discussion with everyone. I have like 100 questions, but I first want to open to other folks. um, so anyone
Sure.
wants to
If
jump
someone,
in?
sure, if someone has one.
Keika, it's nice to see you.
I realized
Uh,
that that talk was a little like also like what I was describing. It kind of jumps from one thing to another. So like
well, and I
there
had
might be
this
some
thought,
gathering of thought required
like
here.
a line popped in my head, like a digression that reinvents the whole.
Mhm.
In a way, like
Yes,
you go through all
nice.
this like crazy digression and maybe you do like an infinite thing, but somehow, even if we didn't get anywhere, even if motion is an impossible task or something, we somehow transformed everything and have a
Yeah,
new framing. And there's,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, exactly. Nice, very nicely put.
So, if nobody else has a question just now, can I jump in? Though it's not
Sure.
exactly in your presentation. I mean, I loved your presentation, so much new things to learn. But I have a very basic question in Leibniz's concept,
Hmm.
which makes me wonder that if the monads are closed, like
Hmm.
they decide everything what to be done
Right.
on their own. So that means they know others without really communicating with them.
Without encountering them, yes, or communicating with them,
Yeah.
yes.
So that means, I mean, it indicates that the whole is in each.
The whole is, I'm sorry,
Oh, the whole, sorry, I'm bring the microphone, sorry.
I just missed that one word.
The whole is in each.
Is in each, yes.
Yes.
Yes. Yes,
Yes.
everything, yes. The entire universe is inside every
Each.
monad
Yeah.
as a perception. Yeah.
Yeah. So that way, I mean, it's that's why it makes sense as a logical unit. It's not a physical
Yes.
separate unit. So
Yes.
they're logically separate. Now, if they know the whole, what
Mhm.
is the need for God? In the sense, God
Oh.
that is that may
Mhm.
that's the only one which is
Mhm.
outside. I mean, not
Right.
each monad, but
Right.
something which can make the composable universe. Why
Oh,
was it needed?
compossible. Oh, you okay. I like that. You're using compossible. That's a very Leibnizian term. I'm very impressed that you're asking about compossible. Well, so you're asking why do you need God for this? Okay. So one way to answer that is to say, you're not, people in Leibniz's day asked that as well. And he was suspected of atheism, because it seemed like a mechanism that could maybe work on its own without a God. Leibniz would disagree with that. Leibniz is the one who arranges the whole dance, right? Because um, it's not just that monads perceive the whole universe, sometimes confusedly, sometimes distinctly from a particular point of view, but they have to be constructed in such a way that they don't interfere with one another, right? And that's what compossibility is. Their possibilities have to coexist. And so God is the principle that maximizes compossibility, right? He um, creates the maximum number of creatures that can fill this space so that they don't interfere with one another to the degree that things become chaotic or disordered. Okay. And this feeds into his notion of that this is the best of all possible worlds. It's not that bad things don't ever happen. It's not that some monads don't come to a bad end. Um, but God is the one who chooses the maximal sequence that allows the maximum of being and the maximum of beauty and the maximum of justice and so forth to exist in the world. So that's why you need God. I mean, first of all, and also someone has to create these monads, right? They don't just pop out of nothing. For him, there has to be a creator for them. So God creates them and he arranges their dance, their harmonious dance in such a way that they each get to experience a maximum of reality without getting in each other's way for the most part.
Can I ask a
have a
follow-up? Oh no,
question?
Kika, go ahead. Go ahead, Kika. Yeah.
Thank you. So basically that for me that contradicts the concept that the whole is in each, because if the whole is truly in each, then there is no separation. It's only logical separation. It's a conceptual separation, not a real separation. And that's why there cannot be any discord, and there is no reason for any resolution. And then there is no creation, first of all, because the whole is just appearing as each. It's not created from that point of view, because whole cannot be created. Whole is itself.
Okay, I hear what you're saying, and I'm not saying it doesn't make sense to me. It seems to me you're starting to turn Leibniz into Spinoza.
That's exactly what I was thinking.
You seem to be arriving at a sort of deus, God or nature view. But I mean, monads are different from one another, right? Like each has a different perspective on the world, right? Each has a different set of perceptions. So they are distinct. You can't really talk it. You couldn't mix them together and just into one view of the universe. Each has a particularized view and things are different. And that's why it's that particularity that causes them to exist at all, right? There's a richness for for Leibniz in multiplying the number of perspectives on the universe. So the universe is not only various in itself, but it's perceived variously. And because of that, you can't just add them up. Like each one is different from the other. And so you can't get to a kind of Spinozan ontology that way. And he needs God as a separate creator in order to, because otherwise he just doesn't understand, you know. I mean, maybe in the 20th century, you could talk about like self-ordering systems or something, or so, but he doesn't have that idea. He needs the idea of a creator God who makes each of the and decides that monads will exist because the perspective that they occupy is itself an interesting or enriching one, right? He doesn't just like multiply them in a kind of monotonous way endlessly. So there's kind of judgment and decision required in order to put this harmony of perspectives together. And that's the role that God's playing in this. Though, it is it's like an ingenious toy that he's created and winds up. And once he does it, he doesn't seem to be necessary for the working of it particularly. And that's what led people to suspect him of a complicated kind of atheism. So, I mean, I think there's something to your point, but
Well,
he would have an answer. Yeah, sure.
Can I follow up on that? Because Deleuze says for Leibniz, God is constantly calculating, right? And is kind of like actively still a part of things.
Yeah.
Like he's not finished. Like sure, there's the pre-established harmony and that sets it up to start, but for some reason he's still, tinkering almost. And I don't know if Deleuze goes that far to give it that, but it does feel that, and like in the discourse on metaphysics, philosophy and the activity of God become very close to each other. And it's particularly because of this tinkering expand like, and this kind of like, I don't know, you could call it opulent or filigree or Baroque
Mhm.
fugue, or this kind of like endless folding that yeah, that these digressions that just endlessly
Yeah.
produce novel complexity,
I
right?
like that. Okay. Yes. Now, okay. I hear what you're saying, and you're doing a very Deleuzean thing when you make that
Mm.
remark, which is to say you're turning Leibniz into Alfred North Whitehead.
Yeah, fair.
And I think that the notion of tinkering isn't there in Deleuze at all. That's just
Okay.
me. That's not
Yeah.
his. And he doesn't.
Well, that was
Now he
partially
does
my
say that
question.
God
Yeah.
is, yes, God is calculating, and God is for Leibniz, nothing exists unless God sort of gives his approval at
Mm.
every moment, which is kind of, it's like a battery pack that gets it. He talks about continuous fulgurations, like
Right.
continuous thunderings from
Yeah.
God,
Yeah.
sustain things in their being. And
Mm.
if God were to withdraw that for even a moment, they would cease to be. So
Mm.
he still is involved in the unfolding. He's kind of
Mm.
powering it, but Leibniz would not want to say that he's making it up as he goes,
Okay.
that he really has the whole thing kind of planned out and has chosen. There's that famous allegory
Mm.
at the end of his that was great theological work in which there's like different universes or like balls. There's like a giant pyramid of balls, you know, piled on one another, and those are the different sequences that the universe could take, and God picks the best one.
Mm.
So there's
Right.
that initial moment, like
Yeah.
this sequence is the one.
Mm.
So in that sense, he's not improvising.
Yeah. Okay.
I think a Whiteheadian God would be more
Right.
sort of making it up as he goes along.
Mm.
Um, okay. Anyway, anything else?
Well, I mean, just to follow up on that question
Sure.
too, again, like the collapsing of Leibniz into Spinoza, I think is a real question. And like, it's clear that Leibniz is trying to not let that happen.
Yes. Yeah.
And in the discourse on metaphysics, again, he says something like, you know, for Spinoza, the idea of a triangle affirms itself in both of us, and we have like the same, like we're both the
Mhm.
mind of God thinking the idea.
Yeah.
And for
Yeah.
Leibniz, he's like, no, like it's completely like perspective is not just a sort of like extra layer or something added to the truth.
Mhm.
Everything has to be a perspective, and there's
Yeah.
no way that the triangle idea could exist in God and then exist in me and exist in you.
Yeah.
um
Exactly. Yes. 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 The full-on view of the triangle is one that only God has.
mm, mm,
For monads, it's always oblique and it's always partial, and they never quite add up to one another. Yeah, that's really nice. Yeah, I mean, the relation between Leibniz and Spinoza is a really interesting one. Leibniz visited Spinoza and read his philosophy and was deeply influenced, to the degree that some people think that well, there was a book called the Courtier and the Heretic, which was
mm,
published by Norton. But it was kind of a trade book by someone who argues that Leibniz's entire philosophy is plagiarized from Spinoza, which is a ridiculous idea.
yeah.
But I think you're right. But I like the way it was like he was scared of turning into Spinoza, or he
Mm,
wanted like
mm,
that,
mm,
both because he wouldn't be original anymore and because the premises of it really bothered him. And
yeah.
so he turned quite nasty towards
Mm,
Spinoza, and even
sure.
anti-Semitic
Yeah.
towards Spinoza later on,
Mm,
to try to keep that. Yeah, to try to keep their monads separate and from dissolving into one
hmm
point of view, which would be Spinoza's.
hmm
So
hmm
yeah,
I mean, even the question of the unity of substance as for Spinoza, which is the infinite, right?
yeah, yeah.
And then for Leibniz, there's an infinity of substances, but like, how different are these ideas actually? Like, I know that there's
Hmm.
a real attempt by Leibniz to make them very distinct, and like this whole thing
Yeah.
about not sharing ideas, and really the depth of the idea of perspective. I definitely think that Spinoza has not fully, given philosophical voice to this. Really Leibniz
Hmm.
with the je ne sais quoi, the
Hmm.
uniqueness of perspective, and then even like the things that come out within optics and things like
Yeah.
that about perspective.
Yeah. They are different minds. Yeah, I mean, Spinoza at a couple of points in the Ethics, like overtly states his lack of interest in the aesthetic, right? I can't remember where it is, but there are a couple of sentences where he's like, I don't care about
Yes,
issues of beauty
100%.
and so forth,
Yeah,
whereas Leibniz was
yeah,
obsessed with them. And I think, but that difference pushes them in different directions, and that makes them
totally.
different. I
And I
mean,
think even like the enchantedness of the
mhm,
universe and the project of philosophy.
yeah,
Spinoza is much more like disenchanted, kind of practical.
yes,
Um,
yeah,
and
that's
Leibniz is this opulent, like, let's just pluralize everything and like
yes,
open the
exactly.
modalities. And then if they don't all fit together, like, who cares? We'll move on to the next project and like
Yeah,
explode it
exactly.
into infinity.
That's
But
that's
he
great.
does say that that activity is like the activity of God. So that's where and maybe it's just not an ongoing activity or something,
Yeah.
but there is this audacious, and maybe you even use the word audacious
hmm
in the chapter about metaphysics or metaphorical clumping, but
hmm
there's a kind of equation of the philosophical task, and even I would say integrative or interdisciplinary thought that is
hmm
kind of like audaciously claiming to be a divine activity. And of
Yeah.
course, he
That-
stops short of that. Spinoza is super okay with being like, "Hey, we're just the divine activity, you know, doing
hmm
this." And Leibniz
Yeah.
wants to say no, but he does say, like, metaphorically, you know, the architect who draws more out of
Yeah.
the land to make the
hmm
house flourish, and like the writer who uses a few words but like blows your mind with insights,
hmm
this ability to draw more out of less. I don't know how you
Right.
can do that unless it's progressive and
Yeah.
happening in
hmm
time.
And kind of, yes, and also kind of a divine activity, right? Creating
Exactly, and
things,
exactly,
creating
yeah,
more
yeah,
out of less. Yeah. And
yeah.
he does think, Leibniz does think we're mirrors of God. So,
Hmm.
I mean, so is that the difference between being God and being a mirror of God?
Yeah,
I don't know if that quite accounts for it, but it might be a start for trying
no,
to
that's a good
figure
point.
out the
Yeah.
difference between
Hmm.
Leibniz and Spinoza
Josh,
on
do you
that
want to
point.
jump in?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt the conversation, but you brought metaphor back up, Jack, and I kind of wanted to, I guess, ask about how Leibniz sort of, I guess, sees the operative value of metaphor, because I think, today you talk about disenchantment, maybe like metaphor is, if you say love is a rose, we might say that there's like a poetic way in which that's true, but that's a little bit diminutive, right? Like it's just a metaphor, right?
hmm
And I'm
hmm
wondering, like, did Leibniz see anything more in from like sort of an onto-epistemological, like there is
hmm
truth at the level, or that metaphor reveals something like
Yes.
truthful about a resonance between something that you could link through metaphor?
hmm Yes. Well, for one thing, metaphors are composed of images, right? And images have an important epistemological function for Leibniz, okay? Because his understanding. So basically, Leibniz thinks that we're kind of awash in perceptions, and some of them are what he calls confused, and some of them are what he calls distinct. And concepts are distinct, and things like images are confused. Like you can see them, but you can't really explain them in the same way that you could explain a concept. And so, in one sense, he says the role of philosophy is to move towards ever more distinct apperceptions of something, right? To clarify what are confused perceptions into something which is conceptually coherent and so forth. At the same time, he says that that process is necessarily incomplete. There's always going to be a residue of the confused. And in fact, it's in the confused that let me put it this way. When grasped distinctly, objects are separate from one another, right? And well defined, and they have boundaries. But there's another kind of perception for Leibniz, which comes from all these little micro perceptions, remember all these little bodies that are knocking against you because they've been moved by other bodies. And that's what connects you to the universe as a whole. Okay, that's what connects you to the cosmos at every moment. So distinct ideas are useful, and that they're articulable, and but they're also local. But confused ideas or confused impressions are useful because they kind of connect you to everything. And so one of the things that metaphor does, it doesn't clarify his arguments. It actually intentionally muddies them. It plunges you back. You've been in a land of abstract concepts, and now you're suddenly plunged back into the realm of the perceptual and the visual, which is the realm of the confused. Okay, so it's actually meant to confuse his argument in a certain way, not to clarify it or to sort of insist on the limits of clarification. So that would be one of the functions that metaphor exerts in Leibniz. There are other things as well. Since his whole thing is his whole philosophical method. I borrowed the term cognitive mapping from linguists, which is like what I was talking about with the monads. You borrow concepts from physics or optics or painting or law or whatever, and you apply it to different kinds of. That's constantly going on in Leibniz, and that is a kind of metaphorical activity. So I see metaphor as a kind of surface rhetorical manifestation of a much more deeper movement of isomorphisms and analogizing that's going on in Leibniz all the time. And that's what he's mostly up to, regardless of what he's saying at a particular moment. He's kind of mapping things onto one another. So I think that metaphor is important in that sense as well.
Can I quickly ask a very quick question that which book would you recommend for? I'm particularly interested in this this confused part of the metaphorical approach. Which book would you recommend for Leibniz's concept on this?
That would be my book.
Okay.
It might seem I would not give you that answer for any other question,
Okay. All
but
right.
nobody is. I'm more interested in the confused in
Excellent.
most philosophers are interested in the clear and distinct and in the conceptual, and I'm more interested in confusion as a value.
Because
So
I
I would not give that answer to any other question you could have asked, but to that one question, I will say that mine is probably.
No, I'm happy that you said that because I would like to look at that. And
Okay.
I'm wondering if Merleau-Ponty got any of that from him.
I think so, because in fact, there's a whole book on Leibniz and phenomenology. And I'm forgetting the name of the author now. I should look into my bookcase and find it for you. Why don't you, let me see, hold on. Can I disappear for a second?
Sure, I would love to know the
I'm
book.
forgetting the name of it, but I know I can find it. Hold on. Let me see here. Non-brain. No. And of course, I'm not finding it. So, but if you could email me or something, I will, let me get out of this here. I'll send you the reference on Leibniz and phenomenology. If you're still interested after all this.
Very much interested. Thank you so much.
Sure.
Can I ask one follow-up? I know there's a couple hands up, but I just wanted to. Okay, and Jack may be disappointed if I get my question about Spinoza wrong because we're diving into his ethics right now. But from my like sort of characterized understanding of Spinoza without having read too much, my sense is he, like as a rationalist, as he is described as a rationalist, there's this idea that like the God intellect or whatever is able to be grasped through the capacity of reason. And I don't know if he thought that was like actually possible for humans, but at least like through the capacity of reason, you could attain that sort of, whatever.
It's kind of asymptotically possible. You can get closer and closer without ever quite reaching it, because you'd be God sort of if you could.
Right. But like God has that perspective, I guess. And I'm wondering, is does God for Leibniz have sort of like a totalized understanding at his level, or is that also sort of like infinitely expanding in the same way that metaphor always is inexhaustive or points to the inexhaustibility of being?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Leibniz at points does suggest that God has a totalized understanding.
Okay.
But what's interesting is I think part of it is routed through his creatures. So he not only understands the universe as a whole, but since he's created each one, you'd have to assume he kind of sees it from their perspectives as well. So there's something additive about it's kind of the summation of all these partial visions as well as a kind of overarching grasp of the whole. So
Thank you.
cool. Sure. Any other questions?
Yeah, Sam, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, real fast. I came to CIS after teaching AP Physics and AP Calculus for a long time, and being raised up in the Newtonian motion model and all that stuff. But I'm in the ecology, spirituality, and religion program as part of PCC. So we're our weird little subsect. But as far as like ecological thinking, we often talk about relationality and feedback and non-linear thinking and interdependence and all those terms. So if we, I've always wondered this, like if we had gone with the Leibniz model rather of metaphysics rather than sort of the Newtonian sort of push motion.
Or the Baconian model, right, which is based on mastery of nature. Yes, that's a very good point. And actually that
mechanistic causation, that kind of stuff. Like I just wanted to, and thank you so much. I love what you presented. I've got so many notes, but I would love to hear your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, there are actually several thinkers have had that thought that you're thinking that because sort of everything is alive for Leibniz and everything is sort of irreplaceable because no two things are alike or no two minds are alike, and even inanimate things have a kind of mind for Leibniz. That discourages a kind of instrumental approach to nature as something that you master and something that you make use of, and substitutes for it a more kind of aesthetic stance of something that you wonder at and appreciate and try to understand. So there have been, now in fact, Spinoza, not Leibniz, has been very influential among environmental thinkers to a much greater degree, but there are a few people who have used Leibniz's approach as well to think about environmental matters. It's kind of a niche area, but it does exist. So I think you're absolutely right. It was kind of a road not taken, by instrumental reason, and maybe we would be better off in some ways if we had taken a more Leibnizian path.
I mean, you could trace from Uxkol and Whitehead and Merleau-Ponty and certain things like, and even Deleuze influences on the ecological.
So maybe more of an indirect and not rather than a direct.
I love like pointing out when it's like somebody says something, it's like, wait a second, that's monadology. Like, there it is again. And like, don't be scared and like upset. Like, you should be upset when atomism comes in, not when monadology is more respectable in this day and age.
Candace, did you have a question? You were
yes, I do. I have two quick things. First of all, this is so much fun. I wish we could do this every night. So the first thing is I'm working on a big creative project that's relevant to something you said, and so I'd like a reference that in Leibniz, God has a perspective of each creature in a very distinct way, and each one is irreplaceable. And so I'm wondering, is there some particular part of Leibniz she would send me to where I could really find that concentrated? That's kind of an unfair question on the spot.
No, it's not unfair. It's a very
Okay.
fair question. I would
Okay.
say that unlike most of what I was saying,
Yeah.
I would say most of what I was saying in Leibniz, I could send you to a particular passage. I'm actually kind of inferring that
Okay.
from some things. So I don't know. I'll poke around a
Okay.
little
Thank
bit.
you. And Jack, could you
And
also
if I can find one, but
Yeah.
I think I'm kind of putting that's more my read on Leibniz than something he's specifically. Though
I mean,
it
you
seems
have
to
chapters of
follow. I mean,
your
he does.
you have chapters of your book that kind of more directly address that
Yeah,
question.
but it still doesn't quote Leibniz saying exactly that thing.
Sure.
So
Fair.
That's
yeah.
okay. I'll take you riffing on Leibniz.
Okay,
Right
okay.
there.
Fair
And then
enough.
the
If I can
second thing,
find an original,
yeah.
I'll
Oh, that would be wonderful. And then the second thing I wanted to ask, you've referred, to Whitehead a couple times. I know there are a lot of things Whitehead liked about Leibniz, and can you help me remember what those are, or just like what was his affinity for Leibniz? I mean, he critiqued him in some ways, but he also seemed to draw on him.
Well, he in Process and Reality, he refers to his own project as a monadology at one point. So that should say something about the depth. But I think the way that so what what Deleuze is trying to liberate in Leibniz is the process philosopher. Okay, like he's really saying, okay, he looks like a substance philosopher, but he's really a process philosopher. And so the monad is constantly in change, constantly evolving. And that's something like a Whiteheadian conception. And also the fact that monads are in contact, they're not communicating with, but they're sort of perceiving everything else in the universe, and their perceptions are constituted by every other entity in the universe is also a kind of Whiteheadian perspective on the way things are formed or constituted in the first place. So I don't know, when I look at Whitehead, there's a lot of Leibniz there, but then I think, oh, there's a lot of Spinoza there. There's a lot of Kant
no, that was really helpful.
But I think that would be a few. And he is also interested, Whitehead is also interested in confused perception as well, like the distinct and the confused. That's an important thing he plays with. So all of that's coming out of Leibniz and more. But those would be a few things that pop into my head.
And you do have a chapter in your book. Again, there's a chapter in the Leibnizing book about Whitehead. And just one more thing to clear up: the Deleuze Fold book has a chapter about Whitehead and Leibniz. And so you're kind of constellating all of these things.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Okay, that's cool. What are you doing with, you're using Whitehead in a creative project?
No, I'm actually using probably Dorothy Cavendish more than anyone else, but I'm also looking at sort of her other genealogy, and it's a very large art project. So
cool.
This is just another thread that I'm really interested in.
Oh, that's cool. Very, very cool.
I am definitely not an artist, but I'm giving this a roll.
Well, if that's it, thank you all for
I actually have a question.
Okay, sure.
So yeah, this has been great. Just I always feel like speaking about the lineage of Deleuze is kind of like a smooth ride that flattens out the space and allows the lines to kind of just merge into each other. So it's been good. So I have a question about politics, and especially because of your upcoming book, Socialism for Pessimists and Post-Capitalism Without Illusions. I thought that was a fascinating title, and it's kind of Mark Fisher-esque. So
I consider myself to be darker than Mark Fisher and less dark at the same time.
Amazing.
Great. Okay. Or connections between this and that? Are you interested in, or?
Am I interested in
Well, why do you bring it up?
Yeah, you're raising
Because
it. Why are you
in this context, because
well, just the title,
okay.
and Leibniz's, I just have a question about Leibniz's politics
Mm-hmm.
and how, because I'm thinking Deleuze says that change isn't always constant as we may think.
Mm-hmm.
His philosophy seems to implicate.
Yeah.
So the fold that he suggests has an ethical and political implication,
Mm-hmm.
and how subjectivity takes shape. So you're speaking of Leibniz, the fold approaches infinity not as an abstract, but as a lived continuity.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just thinking, yeah, what do you think this fluid, plural, and mobile movement
Mm-hmm.
has for the humanities and its political and ethical uh, movements, I guess?
Yeah. Ooh, that's such an interesting question, and well formulated. I don't even know where to start. I don't even know where to start with that. For one thing, Leibniz himself was very studiously apolitical because he didn't want to offend his patrons or say anything that would stop the money flow to him. So there's a kind of elusiveness to his politics. His official politics are a kind of constitutional monarchist version. He believes in something that looks kind of like a republic, so that would seem to be moving him kind of in a slightly Spinozist direction, but then there's a king at top of it. And it's not a very interesting. This isn't getting me to the answer your question. Okay, more interesting things happen with the monads themselves. And so I actually have a chapter titled Monadic Politics. And it's very interesting because political language starts to infiltrate Leibniz when he describes how bodies are put together, okay, which is something Deleuze would definitely like. So bodies are a problem for him because they're composed of these tiny parts, which are then themselves composed of tiny parts and themselves composed of tiny parts. And why doesn't it all fall together like a piece of like sand or something? Well, there's something he calls a dominant monad in it, which grants it its unity. So for instance, a mouse is made of parts, but then there's the mouse mind that holds it together and makes it into a mouse. So this language of dominant and dominated starts entering Leibniz's vocabulary. But then what he does with it is so strange and interesting. He kind of undoes domination because no matter where you are, like, okay, you're a dominant monad and the monads within you are dominated by your dominant monad, right? But then they have an infinity, they also have an infinity of monads within them over which they are dominant. And since the process goes on forever, there's no last merely dominated. Monads are both dominated and dominating. And there's a kind of fascinating kind of dialectic that arises out of that. I don't know if that's probably not answering. I'm not moving that. I think your question, a better answer to your question would be routed through Deleuze, and I'm kind of routing it through Leibniz. So I guess I'm kind of avoiding your, but I have to say that the political implications of Deleuze are sometimes a little fuzzy to me, to be honest. So I'm not sure, like if this was ultimately supposed to return us to the real political world and a political and ethical stance towards it, I'm not sure it's going to get us there. In a way, you're trying to pose a practical question, right, for Leibniz. And I've been showing how he keeps evading practicalities keep dissolving into different kinds of infinity. And so I'm going to avoid your question a little bit. I think it's it's also apolitical in that sense as well, right? If you're a tinkerer, I don't want to have an ethic of the political tinkerer. Like, that doesn't seem useful, and certainly not useful at this moment. So I'm not sure, although there are many things I love about Leibniz, I'm not sure that we can or someone cleverer than I am will have to kind of extract an interesting ethico-political project from him. I think it's much easier to do, obviously infinitely easier to do with Spinoza. Everybody pulls it, right, from Negri to Deleuze to a million other people are pulling radical political philosophies out of Spinoza. There's a reason why nobody does that with Leibniz, right? There's a reason why he hasn't gotten that, and all, Althusser, Balibar. I mean, so many Marxists are entranced with Spinoza. They just aren't interested in Leibniz. And let's take their intuition seriously. They've seen something about Spinoza and they've seen something about Leibniz, and it might be hard to.
Well, let me throw in, because you do mention Tarde, Gabriel
Yes.
Tarde. So
Yeah.
he might be the one who kind of, because he has
Yes.
this book,
Although-
Sociology, Monadology, I think is the title.
But that's so crazy. I mean, what
It
do
is
you
crazy.
do with him? I mean, that's just, it's fascinating, but I don't know as an orientation towards
But you can see this
there
move
are-
in Deleuze, like, especially because
Yeah.
late Deleuze is like the Leibniz Deleuze and the early Deleuze. And that's, of course, people.
There are interesting political vectors that emerge from Taut as there is from Leibniz, but it's just, they're like flashes of something. I don't know how to articulate it into something as coherent or useful as an ethics.
Fair.
Yeah. So, sorry, that I totally failed. That was really, and I just
No, it's okay. It's great. We'll just keep going with this unclear, strange trip, and
okay.
we'll see where we come out on the other end.
Okay, fair enough.
Well, Richard, thank you so much. This was a blast and so much fun. And thank you, Jack, and thank you, Kate, and everyone else who came. And yeah.
Thanks to all of you. I really enjoyed it. Have a great evening.
Thank you,
Richard.
Bye-bye.
Good evening, everyone. See you later.
See you guys.